So the only way to learn and master ECGs is to keep seeing ECGs and discussing them with somebody who actually knows to read them. So it's important for you to identify the right person who can actually read an ECG. Because there are also a lot of people, just like how the Bible talks about having false prophets, you have a lot of people who make it seem as if they know to read an ECG, but they actually don't know to do so. And then it can be quite disastrous because you think he knows and you go to him, but that person may not know. So very important for you to go to the right person with the ECG you have and discuss it with the right person. And the only way to learn it is to keep seeing ECGs. Otherwise, you will not really be able to master the art. So this class is essentially just a few basics and tips and concepts. So more important than actually learning rules, it's important to get the concepts right. And if your concepts are right, then it becomes easy to apply them and make conclusions based on the same. So before we start off on ECG, it's important to understand the electrical system of the heart and the way God has made it and why he has made it so. Because only if we understand that and keep that as a background, will we be able to understand things about the ECG. So I'll just try sharing my screen and you can let me know if you can see it. Yeah, so are you able to see a picture of the heart over there on your screen?
Yes, John.
Okay, all right.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So here you see the heart, you see the sinus node, you see the AV node here at the center. And one sec. Are you able to see my pointer?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So you see the sinus node, you see the AV node, you see the bundle of His. It divides into the right and left bundle branches, which and then essentially the left bundle branch divides into a left anterior fascicle and a left posterior fascicle. And they divide into tiny fibers which go to each and every nook and corner of the heart. So this is something we all learned, I think even way back in school actually. And it's very important to understand that in the school of the heart, there is only one principle. And that principle is the sinus node. So the sinus node calls the shots and the rules as dictated by the sinus node is followed by the rest of the heart. So the sinus node has the ability to spontaneously depolarize at a much faster rate than any other part of the heart, and which is why he essentially is the master conductor. So normally the sinus node depolarizes at around 72 times a minute, but it can range from as low as 60, go as high as even about 180. And in the night, if you are sleeping at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., your pulse may be even as low as 40, 45. So this is the normal range of the sinus node, and the sinus node depolarizes and the impulse from there travels through the atria to reach the AV node. Now, when it reaches the AV node, it gets slowed down in the AV node. And the reason it gets slowed down in the AV node is because the AV node has got cells which conduct the impulse very slowly. Now, why did God make it that way? Why did God make the impulse travel through the AV node slowly? The reason is essentially that it provides time for the ventricles to fill with blood. So while the impulse is traveling through this AV node very slowly, that time blood is filling into the ventricles from the two atria, and the ventricles fill nicely with blood, and that leads to the optimum stretch of the ventricular muscle, and that helps the ventricles to contract and eject that blood forwards. So better ventricular filling in diastole is provided by this delay in the AV node. Now, the AV node also has another important function, and that is that it prevents drama from upstairs going downstairs. Now, what do I mean by drama upstairs going downstairs is the upstairs two chambers are the right and the left atria, and the downstairs two chambers are the right and the left ventricles. So often it happens that you have an abnormal rhythm in the top chambers, like you have an atrial flutter or an atrial fibrillation, where the atria are going on at very fast rates. So if you have the atria going in atrial fibrillation, you are essentially talking about the atria beating at about 600 times a minute. Now, if 600 impulses were to knock on this AV node, and the AV node were to allow every one of those 600 impulses to go down to the ventricles, then the ventricles will be beating at 600 times a minute. Now, you know that your heart is sort of the size of your fist. And if your heart was to sort of contract at 600 times a minute, like, you could do this with your fist and do it like 72 times a minute. If your heart went fast, you can do it like 100 times a minute. You can even do it maybe 200 times a minute. But you can't really do it 600 times a minute. And so when it is 600 times a minute, it's essentially just quivering like this, So when the heart quivers like this, it's not effectively pumping blood forward. So if it doesn't pump blood forward, your cardiac output gets affected. And that affects every single organ in the body. So if you develop atrial fibrillation and the AV node allowed every single impulse to go down, the ventricles would go at 600 times a minute, which would essentially mean ventricular fibrillation with very poor cardiac output. So if this was true, essentially you will see a lot of people dying around you because atrial fibrillation is a very common arrhythmia, relatively speaking, as age increases. So if you were to look at people above the age of 60, you would easily find about 1 in 10 people having atrial fibrillation. So God has given us this AV node, which has this property of slowing down conduction. And so the first impulse comes and knocks on the AV node's door, the AV node will let it through. When the next impulse comes and knocks on the AV node will probably let it through, but it will slow it down. So as this impulse is traveling down the AV node, because it's traveling so slowly, when the third impulse comes and knocks here, it finds that the conduction is refractory. It is not able to go fast. The fourth will also not be able to go fast. And so you see, you have this tissue of AV node, which has multiple cells, and each of them conducting very slowly. So any impulse which comes has to conduct through all the way for it to reach the ventricles. But if while it is conducting through, it finds the cells in the beginning part or the mid part or the latter part of the AV node refractory, it will not be able to go through the entire AV node to go to the ventricles. So that's the point to be very aware of. So if somebody was having an atrial fibrillation with the atria going at 600 times a minute, probably only 1 in 4 of these would be allowed to go down to the ventricles, leading to the ventricular rate being at around 150 beats a minute, which is still reasonably manageable and compatible with life. So though your ventricles are going at 150 beats a minute and though you will feel palpitations, you would still not die, as against if your ventricles were going at 600 times a minute and you develop what is called ventricular fibrillation with very decreased cardiac output. So you've now understood 2 important functions of the AV node. One is the fact that it helps to slow down the impulses, thereby providing time for filling of the ventricles, and the better the filling, the better the cardiac output. The second important function of the AV node was that it prevents drama from upstairs going downstairs. So these are 2 important things to understand about the AV node. Now, when the atria depolarize, they produce the P wave. That's something you are aware of. When the ventricles depolarize, they produce the QRS. But when the impulse is traveling from the atria to the ventricles through the AV node, it's traveling very slowly in the AV node, and you don't really see anything on the ECG that can be recorded as an evidence of AV node depolarization. So that's a period of electrical quiescence. In other words, silence. So when the impulse is traveling through the AV node, you look at the ECG, you will actually have a flat line at that time as it's traveling through the AV node. That is very important for you to know. And that flat line is what happens in your PR segment. That is after the end of the P wave and before the QRS happens, you have that flat PR segment. The flat PR segment is the duration at which the impulse is actually going through the AV node. And you don't see any electrical activity at that time. So we've now spoken about the SA node. We've all agreed that the SA node is like the principle of the heart. We then spoke about the AV node, and we said that the AV node has got these 2 special properties. The special property of decrementing and reducing the rate of conduction, and that has 2 important functions. One is to improve diastolic filling of the lower chambers, and the other is to help with reducing the chance of arrhythmias from the upper chambers to conduct 1-to-1 to the lower chambers. So we've spoken about that, and then we go down to the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. So the impulse in the heart travels really very fast. And in the atria, it travels, and in the ventricles, it's traveling at a rate of about 5 meters per second. When we're talking about the His bundle and the right and left bundle branches, the impulse is traveling at 5 meters per second. So you all sort of know what 5 meters is. So by the time you say 1 second, the impulse has traveled 5 meters. That's the speed at which it travels in the atria and the bundle branches. But in the AV node, it travels at 5 centimeters per second. It is much slower. So you can imagine the difference in magnitude of the speed of the electrical impulse. The AV node, it is 5 centimeters per second, which is probably only this distance in 1 second. Whereas everywhere else, it's 5 meters per second. Now, let me see if I can get this video to play.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you are essentially seeing the sinus node depolarizing, it's depolarizing the two atria, the impulse is traveling through the AV node, and you can see it's taking a very long time to travel through the AV node, and then it zips down to the ventricles depolarize very fast. So sinus node depolarizes, then the two atria, you have your P wave. Now it's an area of quiescence, where there's nothing happening in the atria or the ventricles, and then it goes down to the ventricles. So that is very important for you to understand. So the sinus node depolarizes, then you have the two atria depolarizing, and you have your P wave. And after the P wave has been formed, when the impulse is traveling through the AV node, there is no atrial depolarization, there's no ventricular depolarization. This is a period of quiescence when the AV node is being depolarized, and that is what contributes to your PR segment, that is the end of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS on the ECG, which is why it's a flat line. And then after that, it travels quickly down the bundle of His and the bundle branches to activate the two ventricles, giving a QRS thereafter. So the this thing is very important for you to keep in your mind. And the other thing I would like you to understand is, as you can see from this cartoon, you see that the two ventricles, when they get activated, they're getting activated at almost the very same moment. And the other part significantly earlier, they are all becoming yellow at almost the same time. That is a very important thing to understand. And that is because you have one Purkinje fiber landing in almost every single nook and corner of the ventricle, which is why this part and this part and this part and all of them are sort of getting depolarized at almost the same time. So now, moving on from there, let me explain another small concept to you. So I'm actually a very blackboard person, and I sort of struggle with this new technology. Are you? Yeah, are you able to see this picture that I've drawn?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you have the sinus node here, you have the AV node here, the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, and they give it Purkinje fibers. Now, the thing is that, like I said, imagine this to be the kingdom of the ventricle, the two chambers put together. And let us imagine this kingdom of the ventricle, like, for example, it's like the India map, right? So you've got different states in different places. So, for example, you have West Bengal over here, and you have Andhra Pradesh over here, and you have Tamil Nadu over here, and you have Kerala over here, and you have Gujarat over here, and you probably have Haryana over there. So you've got different states in the kingdom of the ventricle or the kingdom of India. So when a depolarization occurs in Tamil Nadu, you have one small electrical activity there. When the depolarization happens in Kerala, you again have an electrical activity there. And a depolarization happening in Haryana gives you an electrical activity. And a depolarization happening in Karnataka gives you an electrical activity, and so on and so forth. So it's like during the Diwali festival in India, supposing you went to the moon and watched Earth, then you would see the entire India lighted up. And that is because everybody in the country is celebrating and bursting crackers, so that fireworks can actually be appreciated even from the moon, where you see the entire India alone being outlined with light as against the rest of the world. Now, it's possible that I may be bursting crackers and Jesu may be bursting crackers, but sitting in the moon, you will not be able to say that I am bursting crackers and Jesu is bursting crackers. You would just be able to say that the whole of India is celebrating. That's sort of what you would say. So in the same way, when you're doing an ECG, you're recording the electrical activity of the entire heart. You're not recording whether this Kerala is depolarizing or Tamil Nadu is depolarizing or Andhra is depolarizing. You're not recording each of them. You're recording the sum total. So each of these depolarizations will add up to each other. And the sum total of all these depolarizations gives you a QRS. And that QRS is sort of what you actually appreciate on the ECG. Now, if somebody actually had a damage to one of these fibers, so let us say, for example, this fiber and this fiber were damaged, then West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh are going to receive current later than all the other places. So when that happens, you would have Tamil Nadu receiving current on time, and you would have Kerala receiving current on time, and you would have Haryana receiving current on time. But West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh will receive current little later. So when you are doing an ECG that is sitting on moon and recording the electrical activity of the heart, which is what doing an ECG is, then you would be getting the sum total of all these depolarizations. And obviously, it's not all happening at the same time, because only if it happens at the same time, it's sum totals to give you that thin, tall, handsome QRS. But when they all don't happen at the same time, your QRS ends up looking broad and ugly, right? So one important thing for you to understand when you see an ECG is that if you see a broad, ugly QRS, it basically means that different parts of the heart did not get electric current at the same time. Some got it early, some got it late. Now, why is it that some got it late? It may be that some fibers are damaged. It may be that some part of the heart is so hypertrophied that there is a long time taken in current reaching entire part of it. But for whatever reason, every part of the heart has not got activated at the same time. So that is one important concept for you to understand. So now again, going back to what we've discussed so far. So we've spoken about the SA node, and we said that that's the principle of the heart. And then we also spoke about the AV node, and we said that the AV node essentially does the function of flowing conduction from the top chambers to the bottom chambers. And it has two important reasons for doing that. Primarily helping the ventricles to fill in diastole, and secondly, preventing rhythms in the top chamber which are rapid to go down to the lower chamber. Then the next thing we spoke about was about the ventricles, and we said the impulse travels very fast in the bundle branches at about 5 meters per second, but very slowly in the AV node at about 5 centimeters per second. And the ventricles, every single nook and corner gets depolarized at the same time. And because they are all getting activated at the same time, hence you have a thin, tall, handsome QRS. And your QRS will end up looking broad if all parts were not activated at the same time. So then now that you have figured this much, the next thing is to sort of think of the P wave, which is the atrial depolarization. So when we are looking at atrial depolarization again, you see the two atria. If I was to stab one of you from your back, the first chamber of the heart that I will enter will be the left atrium because it is posteriorly located. So if this was sort of like a body circumference and we said this was the left side, this was the right side, and this is the spine. Then we have the heart sort of located like this. This is sort of how the heart is located. Pardon me, I'm not very comfortable with these online classes. I really prefer doing these in person, and ECG is a very in-person thing. But the only unfortunate thing is that the only way to reach many people is through an online session. So the chamber that I've drawn up behind is the left atrium, and this chamber is the right atrium. And you have your SA node, which is delivering the impulses, located sort of around here. Your SA node is located over here, is giving the impulses from there. Now, when you are depolarized, you are placing these ECG leads to record the activity of the heart, and they are like cameras placed around the heart. So each lead will look at its part of the story, and you need to look at all the leads to get the complete picture. It's like that blind people feeling an elephant, where one person feels the trunk and another person feels the body, and each person gives a different description. But to get the entire picture, you need to see what everybody says. So in the same way, when you are trying to figure out how the electric current is traveling through the heart and what is happening, you need to look at all leads, not just one lead or two leads. That's very important. So you've got lead V1, which is sitting in front over here. And if you look at the heart, the right atrium is located here in front, and the left atrium is located at the back. So when the atria depolarizes and causes current to travel through the heart, at that point of time, the current which is produced in the right atrium, it is already produced in the right atrium. So it will obviously travel through the right atrium first. And the most of the right atrium is located in this direction. So the current is traveling to depolarize the right atrium, and it's traveling towards lead V1. So because it's traveling towards lead V1, in V1, you will end up getting a positive depolarization. So that positive is because it's traveling towards lead V1, the initial part of the depolarization, which is as a result of the right atrium getting activated. Now, after some time, which is not very long, the current starts traveling to depolarize the left atrium. Between the right atrium and left atrium, you have some electrical conduction areas. These areas are like where the coronary sinus is located, where the fossa ovalis is located, and there's something called the Bachmann's bundle. So these are all some special tracks that connect the two atria. So the SA node is located in the right atrium. So when it depolarizes, obviously the right atrium will get depolarized first, and then the current will travel through these special tracks from the right atrium to the left atrium to depolarize the left atrium. So now when the left atrium gets depolarized, the current is traveling away from V1. So when current is traveling away from V1, it will record a negative deflection. So your left atrial recording is current traveling away from V1. So one basic principle which I forgot to mention to you before discussing this is that when current travels towards the lead, you get a positive deflection. When current travels away from a lead, you get a negative deflection. So that's very important to know. So whenever you look at an ECG lead, if it is predominantly positive, it means current is traveling towards it. If it is predominantly negative, it means current is traveling away from it. So for example, you take a QRS complex. And if you see a QRS complex looking like this, it is predominantly positive. And let us say you're recording this in lead 1. So now you know lead 1 where it is located. It is somewhere on the left side. So it means that current is traveling towards lead 1. That's what it means. Whereas in the same lead 1, if you ended up having it looking like this, it's predominantly negative, which means current is traveling away from lead 1. That is why it is negative. So it's very important for you to look at either P wave or QRS, and that gives you an idea as to how the current is traveling. So you have, for example, in lead 1, a very positive P wave. It means the direction in which current is traveling through the atria is towards lead 1. Whereas if it was negative in lead 1, then the current, when it's traveling through the atria, is traveling away from lead 1. So same way when you're looking at QRS, it's how the current is traveling in the ventricles. So we were talking about the atria, and we said that if I was to take a knife and stab you, then the first chamber that I will enter when I poke with my knife is I'm going to poke into your left atrium, because that is located right at the back. So your SA node depolarizes, and it will cause the atria to depolarize first. So the atria get depolarized, and that involves the atria being located in front of the SA node. That will lead to a positive deflection in lead V1, because current is traveling towards V1. But subsequently, the left atrium gets depolarized, and the left atrium is located behind. So current is now traveling away from V1, giving you a negative deflection. So your lead V1 is going to involve both the right atrium and the left atrial depolarization. And hence, if you were to look at lead V1, your ECG will look like this. If you look at the P wave in lead V1, it will be biphasic. It will have a positive component and a negative component. The positive component is because of the right atrial depolarization, and the negative component is because of the left atrial depolarization. So now again, let us say somebody has got the left atrium which is grossly enlarged. That means it's going to take long time for the current to travel and depolarize that entire left atrium, which means for a long period of time, current is going to be traveling in the direction of the green arrow, traveling away from V1. So if you were to look at lead V1 in that person, you would end up having a P wave looking like this. The positive deflection will be very small, but the negative deflection will be large and prolonged, because it's taking long time for that left atrium to depolarize. On the contrary, you look at another person who has got right atrial enlargement. So we are looking at somebody who has got, for example, a disease called tricuspid stenosis. So when you have got tricuspid stenosis, your right atrium is trying to send blood into the right ventricle, but it's facing a lot of resistance, and so the right atrium gets enlarged. So this enlarged right atrium will automatically mean you're going to have a lot of current that is traveling towards V1, because this right atrium is no longer a small structure. It has got enlarged. So this right atrium, instead of being small like this, will be much bigger like that. So as it is bigger, you will have so much more current that's going to be traveling from the SA node towards lead V1. So with all this current traveling towards lead V1, when you are going to look at the ECG of the P wave, you would end up having a very dominant positive P wave and a very small negative, or you may not even see a negative, because I told you the sum total of these two. And if your right atrium is going to take a very long time to depolarize, instead of it being like this, it will end up being like this, because it's taking long time, a lot of atrial muscle to depolarize. So it will swallow up this negative. And so when you do the addition of this plus this, you would end up getting a P wave which is predominantly only positive. You may not see any negative at all, because the negative has got swallowed up by this great amount of right atrial activation. So you now would have understood that in atrial enlargement, if it was right atrial enlargement, and you're looking at lead V1, you would have a predominantly positive activity. Whereas if it was left atrial enlargement and you're looking at V1, you would have a biphasic P wave with a very obvious negative. And the normal P wave in lead V1 is predominantly positive with a small negative. It's biphasic with predominant positive and small negative. So again, let's go back to what we were talking about. We were saying that, sorry, just give me a sec. Yeah, so we were talking about the SA node, we spoke about the AV node, we spoke about the time taken by the AV node to conduct, and we spoke about the significance of the PR interval and the PR segment. So you know that in ECG you have essentially P wave. Oh, I'm so sorry about this. So you have a so this is an ECG, and you have a P wave, you have a QRS, and you have a T wave. The P wave, as you know, is atrial depolarization, the QRS is ventricular depolarization, and the T wave is ventricular repolarization. Now, when we talk about intervals on the ECG, and we say P wave, and we say QRS, now the PR interval is starting from the beginning of the P to the beginning of the QRS. But when we talk about the PR segment, we're talking of the end of the P to the beginning of the QRS. So remember this basic term in ECGs. Whenever they're talking about segments, it does not involve waves. But when they say intervals, it involves waves. So when they're saying PR segment, it's from the end of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS, and that is a flat line, and that flat line is because of AV node depolarization. But when they speak about the PR interval, they're speaking about the P wave and the AV node. So that's the much bigger thing. It includes the atrial depolarization plus the AV node, plus it also takes a very short amount of time to depolarize the bundle branches to reach the ventricle, because the impulse has to reach the ventricle to give your QRS. All right, having spoken about the PR interval, now when you talk about the PR interval, we have to talk about what all contributes to the PR interval. So we already know from before that we have the picture of the heart where you have the AV node, and then comes the bundle of His, and then the right and the left bundle branches. So then you have the Purkinje fibers, which gives you the QRS. So if you're talking about PR interval, you're talking about the P wave, which is atrial depolarization, and then they have to reach all the way to the ventricles to give you your QRS. So for it to reach all the way to the ventricles, it should have traveled to the AV node, bundle of His, and the bundle branch. So the time in your PR interval includes atrial depolarization as well as depolarization of the AV node, the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers. All that has to have happened. Only then you'll get your QRS. So now, when you look at your own families, so some of you would have father, mother, brother, sister, and so on. So let us say the family is going out to attend a wedding, and they all decide to get dressed up and ready to go for the wedding. Now, invariably, what happens is that the father of the family will probably take about 5 minutes to get ready. And the son in the family will also probably take about 5 to 7 minutes to get ready. But the daughter and the mother will take longer time. And sometimes, you know, the daughter will take 10 minutes, whereas the mother may take half an hour, because she will wear one sari and then think that doesn't look good. She'll change it to another sari, and then she thinks that's not good. And then she may think she wants to go in churidar, and then suddenly she may decide she wants to put some makeup on, and so on and so forth. So even if the father was ready in 5 minutes, the family can't leave at the end of 5 minutes. They can only leave when the whole family is dressed up and ready, which may ultimately be half an hour or 45 minutes, depending on how long the mother took to get ready. So you see that what determines when the family finally leaves for the wedding is not determined by the time the father takes to get ready or the son takes to get ready, but it's determined by the time taken by the mother to get ready. So now, let us say that the father decided that, he decided that he was not, he wanted to take some more time than usual to get ready. He decided that he wanted to sort of change his hairstyle, or he wanted to wear a different shirt. He normally takes 5 minutes to get ready. He decided to change 2 shirts. So instead of becoming 5 minutes, it became 15 minutes. Will that affect the time the family takes to go for the wedding? Definitely not, because mother is already taking about 30 to 45 minutes. So this man taking 15 minutes as against 5 minutes is not going to make any impact in terms of delaying the family. But let's now look at the mother. She's sort of taken 30 minutes to get ready. And then she decides that, oh no, I want to actually change this sari and this necklace because this doesn't seem to go well. So now that is going to take another 15 minutes. So what was 30 minutes is now going to take 45 minutes, which means it's going to have a huge impact on when the family goes to the wedding. So a delay in the time taken by the father or the son is not going to cause a huge impact in the time that the family goes to the wedding, but the delay in the mother getting ready actually has a huge impact. Now let's look at the cardiac conduction system. The AV node is like the mother, whereas the bundle of His, the bundle branches, the Purkinje fibers, and the atria are like the father and the son. So they take not too long, whereas the AV node takes a long time. So if you have a PR interval, we know the normal PR interval is about 80 to 120 milliseconds. Now, if you were to have a prolonged PR interval, the most likely reason, the most likely culprit as to why that PR interval is prolonged and delayed is the AV node, which is like the mother who takes time to get ready. If there was disease in the bundle of His, or there was disease in the bundle branches, that can also cause the PR interval to get prolonged. But the amount by which it's going to prolong the PR interval is going to be very small. Because as it is, the bundle of the His takes less than 40 milliseconds to depolarize. It probably takes about 10 milliseconds. So if the bundle of His was diseased, 10 milliseconds becoming 15 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds is not going to be a big deal. Same thing about the bundle branches. But that AV node normally itself takes about 80 to 90 milliseconds to get depolarized. Now, when that is diseased, it's going to take even longer and it's going to make it very obvious. So when you see PR interval prolongation, though PR interval prolongation can happen due to disease in His bundle, disease in bundle branches, disease in atria, disease in Purkinje fibers, the major contributor for PR interval prolongation is going to be AV node. It's very unlikely that the other guys are going to be contributing. So we said the normal PR interval was around 80 to 120. It can go up to about 200 sometimes. Now let us say you have somebody with a grossly prolonged PR interval of say 300 milliseconds. Now when you have a PR interval of 300 milliseconds, you can't put the blame on the father and the son for having taken so long to get ready, because they normally don't take that long to get ready. So obviously, a 300 milliseconds PR interval is not because of delay in the bundle of His or the Purkinje fibers. It's because of delay in the AV node. Whereas if you look at the PR interval, the PR interval was just slightly prolonged, it was 150 or 160 milliseconds, then it could be that it has happened due to disease of His bundle or Purkinje fibers as well. It could be. You can't be sure. So when you see a grossly prolonged PR interval, it could not have been caused by bundle of His or Purkinje fibers. It has to have been caused by the AV node. So a hugely prolonged PR interval means it's an AV node problem, which is usually not a major issue, as against a PR interval which is marginally prolonged, but that is likely could be AV node, but it also could be bundle of His or Purkinje fibers, which could be a major issue. So that's another important thing for you to understand, an important concept to understand. So we've now looked at a couple of different concepts. The first concept we looked at was about the SA node being the primary player in terms of depolarizing. And then we looked at the concept of the AV node, which takes time to depolarize, and hence that reason God made it that way to contribute to that PR segment was so that you have time for the ventricles to fill, and you also have time for the you prevent arrhythmias in the upper chamber to go to the lower chamber. And then we looked at the ventricles and we said that unlike Tamil Nadu, where you have certain areas in the state which never have electricity cut, and certain other areas where you may always have an electricity cut, God didn't make it that way. God made every nook and corner of the heart to receive current at the same time. And because everybody receives current at the same time, hence you get one thin, tall, handsome QRS. And if they didn't receive current at the same time due to some disruption in the conduction or some areas being hypertrophied and hence taking longer time, then your QRS becomes broad and ugly. So when you see a broad and ugly QRS, you straight away know that all areas have not got current at the same time. So then after that, we also looked at the PR interval and we said that the main contributor to the PR interval is the AV node. And hence, if you see a grossly prolonged PR interval, it has to be an AV nodal problem because the other guys cannot have contributed to it. Whereas if you see a slightly prolonged PR interval, then it could be bundle of His or Purkinje fibers as well. So we've sort of looked at various different key concepts which are crucial towards understanding ECGs and the way we think of it. The other point which I covered was about the atria. We said that the left atrium is located behind the right atrium. So when the SA node depolarizes, obviously the right atrium gets depolarized first. And because the right atrium gets depolarized first, you end up having a current traveling towards V1, thereby giving a positive P wave in V1. And subsequently, it travels backwards to depolarize the left atrium. So it's traveling away from lead V1, giving a negative deflection. So V1 normally would have a biphasic P wave with a positive and a negative. The initial part being positive, the latter part being negative. We also said that if you have right atrial enlargement, then you would end up having a huge positive P wave. Whereas if you had left atrial enlargement, you would end up having a deep negative component to that P wave, which is very prominent and obvious. So the other key concept for you to know is that when current travels towards the lead, it gives you a positive deflection. It travels away from the lead, it gives you a negative deflection. It's important for you to know where the various leads are located, and I don't need to sort of cover that for you because you obviously can look that up in any book, but it's important for you to know where leads are located because that will sort of tell you whether current is traveling towards that lead or away from that lead. So when you're looking at P wave, a prominent positive P wave in lead 1 for that matter means the atria, current is traveling the atria towards lead 1. And same way, if you saw a negative QRS in lead 1, it meant that the ventricles were getting depolarized away from lead 1. Current is traveling away from lead 1. So we've now spoken about several very basic concepts. The other important concept that you need to understand is with regards to the ventricles and how they get depolarized. So your ventricle sort of something like this, right? Now, this is your left ventricle, this is your right ventricle, this is your lead V6, and this is lead V1. Now, when current comes to the heart and causes depolarization, the initial few seconds of current is depolarizing the septum. And we all know that the left ventricle is pumping blood to the whole body, whereas the right ventricle pumps blood only into the lungs. So obviously the left ventricle has a much greater task to do and faces a lot more resistance. And hence the left ventricle is much, much thicker than the right ventricle. So your left ventricle is not a very thin structure, it's in fact quite a thick structure. Now, when current is depolarizing the lower chambers, it will initially depolarize the septum. And when we look at it depolarizing the septum, the current is going to be traveling from this side of the septum in this direction and from the right ventricular side of the septum in this direction. But we know obviously that the left ventricle is much thicker than the right ventricle. So obviously the component in this direction is going to be greater than the component in the other direction, leading to net current traveling in the direction of the red arrow. So the net current of septal depolarization is going to be away from lead V6, which is located on the left side. So obviously, lead V6 is going to record a negative deflection. Whereas the current is traveling towards lead V1, which means lead V1 is going to record a positive deflection. Now, after the septum gets depolarized, by the time the current has reached the lateral walls of the ventricle. And when it reaches the lateral walls of the ventricle, you obviously will have current traveling in this direction towards the left free wall of the ventricle, left ventricle. And you would also have current traveling in this direction towards the right ventricle free wall. So you have current traveling towards V6 and current traveling towards V1. But here again, the V6, it's like a tug of war. Current is traveling that way and this way. But the net result of the current, obviously the left ventricle being much thicker than the right ventricle, is going to be towards V6. So now more current is traveling towards V6 than V1 because you add up what is going towards the left ventricle, add up what is going towards the right ventricle. The net response is going to be towards left ventricle. As a result of that, your current traveling towards V6 is going to be major, so you'll end up having a positive deflection. Whereas here, current is traveling away from V1, so you'll end up having a negative deflection. So this is a very important concept to understand in the sense that the lateral leads are going to record a QR complex, whereas the medial leads like V1 are going to record a RS complex. Because current is traveling initially towards V1, that's why that small R wave, and then it goes away from V1, so that deep S wave. Whereas in V6, you have current traveling initially away, and then the current starts traveling towards V6, and hence you have the positive deflection. So we've now looked at another important concept where we are talking about the septal depolarization, the depolarization of the septum of the heart. And the septal depolarization is your Q wave in V6 or your small R wave in lead V1. So if you don't see that small Q wave in V6 or that small R in V1, then it means there's something wrong. For some reason, the septum is not getting depolarized in the way in which it should be getting depolarized. That's something for you to understand. So we've now added a new concept in addition to what we've already had. We've spoken about the SA node, we spoke about the AV node, we spoke about the conduction system being slow in the AV node, we spoke about the PR interval, we spoke about how first degree heart block where you have a prolonged PR interval, the major contributor is the AV node. We then spoke about the left ventricle and the right ventricle, and said the left ventricle is much thicker. The septum gets depolarized earlier than the free wall. So the septal depolarization contributes to the Q wave in V6 because current is initially traveling away from V6, and later on current travels towards V6 when the free walls are getting depolarized, and hence you have a prominent R wave in V6. So a QR is what you see during ventricular depolarization. All right. So we will now move on to one last concept before I close, because too many things being said will also make you forget what was being said. And the last concept is going to be about the axis for a ECG, axis. So when people talk about axis, it's sort of confusing, and some people who know ECGs will just rattle off, oh, this is the axis and that's the axis, and it sort of leaves the others feeling very small and confused and not knowing what is being spoken about. So to understand about the axis, I will first give you an illustration. And this is about when we guys were medical students and we had finished our final year exams. At that point of time, some of the boys in my class decided that they wanted to take a break. And towards taking this break, they decided that they were going to go to Bangalore. And from what I understand, Bangalore has this place called MG Road where there are a lot of pretty girls to look at. So this group of boys decided that they were going to Bangalore and they wanted to see these pretty girls. And now these boys who are all going to be doctors, obviously didn't want to look very, they didn't want to come back at the end of the day and one boy say he saw some pretty girl and the other boy not have seen that. They didn't want that. They wanted all of them to have seen everybody. It shouldn't be that some saw more and some saw less. So they decided that when they actually go down the streets of MG Road, if this was the group of boys, they decided that they would plot this and they would call a pretty girl in front of them at 12 o'clock, a pretty girl towards their right as 3 o'clock, a pretty girl behind them as 6 o'clock, and a pretty girl towards the side as 9 o'clock. So you have this group of 4 or 5 boys walking down this MG Road, and then suddenly one of them spots a pretty girl at 3 o'clock. He would say, "Hey, look at 3 o'clock, man." And then everybody would just casually turn in the direction of 3 o'clock, and then they'll say, "Oh, yeah, etc., etc." So at the end of the day, they were all very happy because everybody saw the same things, and it was not that some people saw more and some people saw less. But the most important thing, the reason behind their success was that they had actually plotted the axis of the pretty girl in relation to their position. So that was the universal rule that all 5 of them could understand. So when you said 12 o'clock, they knew they had to look straight ahead. When you said 9 o'clock, they knew they had to look to the left. So that made it very, very easy for all of them. And that helped them to come back at the end of their day with a very successful mission. So in the same way, when you look at the heart and you're looking at the axis, and instead of looking at that location of a pretty girl in relation to you, when you're looking at axis, you're looking at the direction of the flow of the electric current. You just have to replace this pretty girl with electric current. That's basically what you're doing when you're looking at axis. So again, you have to set the rules so that everybody understands, right? Otherwise, the chap in UK will not understand what the chap in India is saying, and the chap in India won't understand what the chap in Indonesia is saying. So towards that, they straight away lay down the ground rules. So we spoke about 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 6 o'clock there. Here, what we do is we say, okay, this is how the heart is located in the human body. And we know that the lead that is located over here is lead 1. And we know that the lead that is located over here is lead AVF, right? So we know that. So once you have that, it is just like your 12 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock. So we know this is 1 and this is AVF. Now you know that the atria, the SA node, which is depolarizing the atria, is located over here. So the SA node, which is located over here and depolarizes the atria, will cause the atrial depolarization, and the atrial depolarization is going to be in this direction. So your atrial depolarization is going to be in this direction. And then it comes to the ventricles, and the ventricular depolarization is also going to be in this direction. So you have atrial depolarization and ventricular depolarization both going on in this direction. So what people decided was that they were going to say that this is going to be positive and this is going to be positive. Now, there's no science behind it. For example, many years ago, men decided that they were going to wear shirts and women decided that they were going to wear churidars. So that's just convention. So now a girl wears a shirt, it's different. If a guy wears a churidar, it's again different, right? It's going against convention. So by convention, we've decided that this is going to be plus, this is going to be plus, and this is going to be lead 1, and this is going to be AVF. So the current is traveling in this direction in the heart normally, which is why it is going exactly in the direction of lead 2. So that is why when you look at lead 2, you will end up having a positive P wave as well as a positive QRS in lead 2, because current is always traveling towards lead 2. Now, supposing I wanted to let us say this patient, this gentleman, now has high blood pressure. High blood pressure means increased resistance. Increased resistance means his left ventricle has to face a great amount of resistance to push blood into the aorta. So as a result, it is as if his left ventricle is going every day to the gym and the left ventricle is going to get hypertrophy. So the left ventricle, which was normally a thin thing, has now become very, very, very thick thanks to him having hypertension. So when that happens, what happens is that when the heart has to get depolarized, this muscle is so thick that it is going to take a lot of current to depolarize it. So current will start traveling in this direction. So we just spoke about axis and we said that we have lead 1 and we have lead AVF. And in lead 1 and lead AVF, we said that if it was positive in lead 1 and positive in lead AVF, we called it a normal axis. So when we say positive in lead 1 or positive in AVF, we are meaning that the QRS is going to look like that in 1 as well as like that in AVF. So if QRS is positive in both, then we say it's a normal axis. But now we are talking about somebody who has got left ventricular hypertrophy. So when he's got left ventricular hypertrophy, the left ventricle has become very, very, very thick and fat. So when the left ventricle becomes thick and fat, obviously the current is going to go depolarizing it. So when the current goes to depolarize this left ventricle is thick and fat, you will end up being in the positive zone of lead 1. But in AVF, you are going to go into the negative zone because we said that this is 0. This is positive, that is negative. So AVF, you're moving towards negative. So AVF will now record a negative deflection, whereas lead 1 will record a positive deflection. And when you have that kind of picture, then you will call it a left axis deviation. So in left axis deviation, essentially your current is traveling into that particular direction where lead 1 is going to be positive, but AVF is going to be negative. Now, having spoken about that, let us think about a different scenario. And now in this scenario, we are talking about somebody who has got right ventricular hypertrophy. So let us say we have a patient who has got pulmonary hypertension. So a patient who has a COPD, cor pulmonale, lungs are damaged, develop pulmonary hypertension. Now this right ventricle is going to struggle to pump blood into the lungs. So the right ventricle is going into the gym every day, the right ventricle gets hypertrophied. Now this heart, which was like that, is no longer going to be like that, whereas the right ventricle gets hypertrophied, and so your heart gets rotated like this, with this right ventricle becoming so hypertrophied, as a result of which it's going to take a lot of current to depolarize the right ventricle, and so current is going to travel in this direction. So now current is traveling towards this quadrant where it is positive in AVF, but it is becoming negative in lead 1. So as a result, when you see here, when you have right ventricular hypertrophy, you're having positive in AVF, but negative in lead 1. And that is right axis deviation. So you see, they are right with each other. Lead 1 is trying to reach out to AVF. Who's trying to reach out to lead 1? Unlike in left axis deviation, where they're moving away from each other. Lead 1 is going up, AVF is going down. They're fighting with each other. That is left axis. Whereas on right axis, they like each other. They're trying to sort of touch each other. So lead 1 is going down, AVF is going up, and that is your right axis deviation. So now you can see how once we figured out the ground rules, like those 5 boys did in medical school when they went to Bangalore, they figured the ground rules as to where is 12, 9, 3, and 6. Same way, we figured the ground rules in saying which is positive, which is negative, which is 1 and AVF. Now, whether it is you reading an ECG in some remote corner of India, or somebody reading an ECG in a remote corner of China, or somebody in the UK or US, everybody understands the same thing because they have laid the ground rules of what is positive, what is negative. We know what is 1, we know what is AVF. So you know that if you got left ventricular hypertrophy, you will end up having left axis deviation. If you got right ventricular hypertrophy, you will end up having right axis deviation. Now we've spoken about all this, but having said that, there is still one quadrant which we have not touched. And that quadrant, as you know, is the quadrant which is minus in 1 and minus in AVF. So we are talking about a situation where current is going to travel in this direction. And which is the one lead that is in that direction? The one lead that is located in that direction is none other than lead AVR. AVR. AVR is an orphan lead because it's the only lead that is sitting opposite to the direction in which current normally travels. We already know the current normally travels in this direction, the direction of the yellow, towards lead 2. So whether it's atria or ventricles, when current is depolarizing, the atria also is traveling towards lead 2. Current is depolarizing, the ventricles also is traveling towards lead 2. So lead 2 will have a positive P wave and a positive QRS. Whereas if you are looking at AVR in a normal person, current is traveling away from AVR when it is depolarizing the atria. It is also traveling away from AVR when it is depolarizing the ventricles. So normally, if you were to look at lead AVR, the P wave will be negative because current is traveling away from it. The QRS will also be negative. Current is always traveling away from AVR. So that is how AVR is an orphan lead. It's the only lead sitting there. All the other leads are near each other, like lead 2 and AVF are not far away from each other. But AVR is sitting all alone in a no man's land zone, and it is negative in both in lead 1 and AVR. That is the axis in which AVR is sitting. So current normally doesn't travel towards it. So what can be a situation for current to travel in AVR? The only way it can do so is if your heart does a somersault. We just said how the heart is this brown color picture that I have drawn over here. If the heart was to do an exact flip, back flip, then current will start traveling towards AVR. And only then will you record a positive P wave or a positive QRS in AVR. In other words, if you record a positive P wave and positive QRS in AVR, it means very bad news because it means now current is traveling towards AVR, which it should normally never have done. And it means that your heart has sort of done a somersault for current to travel towards that. So what is the situation where that can happen? It can happen if you've got, when you look at the heart, so let us say it's a normal heart in terms of its appearance. It was like this. It has not done a backflip. But instead of the SA node being the principal and calling the shots, now we are having somebody else calling the shots. And that somebody else is a focus sitting in the ventricle over here. So you have a focus in the ventricle which has sort of got irritated. That focus sitting here is calling the shot and he is sending the current up like that. So when that happens, you have current traveling towards AVR and you will have a positive deflection in AVR. So if you see a positive QRS in AVR, it means current is traveling towards AVR, which means it is bad news because it is obviously meaning current is traveling from like somewhere in the ventricle, like a ventricular tachycardia. So positive AVR is bad news. So with that, I will stop for today because I think going further would be too much. But it's important for you to understand that you cannot learn ECGs by listening to classes like this. To learn ECGs, you need to look at ECGs. So it's important for you to keep seeing ECGs to understand them. But before seeing ECGs, you need to have a few basic concepts. First thing is that every one of you needs to know where the various leads are located. And only if you know the location of the leads will you be able to understand these things. So if you have not actually learned that, please go back and read up where the leads are located. Once you know the leads and where they are located, then it becomes easy. Because you know straight away that AVR is located in a place where no other leads are nearby. And it's in the opposite direction to which current normally travels. Lead 2 is exactly in the direction in which current travels. So lead 2 will be positive in P wave, positive in QRS. AVR will be negative in P wave, negative in QRS. Then we also spoke about various other things, including the AV node and the AV node taking a long time to depolarize and how that helps in improving diastolic filling and prevents arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation or atrial tachycardia to translate to ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, thanks to this refractory period. And we also spoke about the P wave in lead V1, and we said how you have a biphasic P wave in V1 normally, but if it was a very dominant negative P wave, it means there's left atrial enlargement, and a very dominant positive P wave meant it was a right atrial enlargement. We also looked at how the QRS looks in V1 and V6, and we said that in V6 you have a QR complex, whereas in V1 you have an RS complex, and that Q is because of the septal depolarization. And septal depolarization contributes to the Q part of lead V6. So that was another important thing that we discussed. Then we spoke about axis and we spoke about the normal axis, the right axis, the left axis. And then when you look at some smart aleck people, they will use this term northwest axis. And for the longest time, I never knew what this northwest axis meant. But later on, I realized that essentially they are looking at it as if it is a world map kind of thing. So you have this is north and this is south and this is east and this is west. This is standard configuration. So when they say northwest axis, they are referring to something coming in this zone. And that zone is your otherwise known as the extreme axis, which is grossly abnormal. Current should never go in the northwest axis. So current went into the northwest axis, you straight away know that it is probably ventricular tachycardia. So with that, I'll end my class for now, and we can have some more classes in the days coming by. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sorry because I'm actually a blackboard person and I really struggle with the technology and trying to convey these things on a Zoom platform. Hope you all have a good night. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions. Yeah, so somebody wants to know why ECG waves start with alphabet P. So there's a lot of theories behind this. Nobody really knows the exact answer. So there was this thing about the people who described ECGs initially, and there were other letters that were already used for other things. So they wanted to use letters that were unique and not used for anything else. And so they thought ABC is commonly used, XY is commonly used for unknowns in mathematics. And that's why they decided to zoom into P, Q, R, S. Any other doubts, please?
There's someone asking. Yeah, there are some more questions.
Okay, electrolyte imbalances. I myself, I'm not sure. I'll take it as it comes. And why does QRS and T both have positive deflection? Yeah, that is a nice question. That requires some more depth to explain. Maybe I can look into telling you about that next time. Why QRS and T wave have positive deflection.